Hi everyone, getting ready to spray primer on my racer, and I've had a couple of people ask, how do you set up a spray gun? Well, that's a good question because a lot of times the answer you get is, well, it's a feel thing. Well, you just gotta do it. Well, this, well, that. And I'm not gonna lie, it is a feel thing. Everybody does paint a different way. It's kind of an art, but there are fundamentals that help no matter what. And I think one of the biggest fundamentals to know and how to set up a gun is first understanding how it works and the different kinds of guns. So most of the time, you're going to see two different styles of gun. This is a siphon feed gun. The cup is outside, but the cup screws on the bottom. And as you pull the trigger, air flows through and it pulls up through a siphon. These are kind of considered the more old-fashioned guns. When you see them in body shops, a lot of times you'll see them as primer guns because they're just, people don't treat the primer guns nicely, so it tends to be their old beat up stuff. I honestly don't even use this for anything because the amount of paint that we use is so little. It wastes a lot of product and just stuff you can't get out of the cup when you're done. So we just put this one aside for now. If you want to use those, it's fine, don't worry about it. These are the more common type that you'll see. These are called gravity fed guns, and because gravity just pushes down on the fluid, it comes out through the top and it just ejects it because of gravity. If you just pull the trigger, the fluid will start coming out. That won't happen with a siphon feed gun. So what we'll do now is we'll take this apart and we'll go through it part by part to explain what happens. Okay, now that we got the gun apart, I suppose the best place to start is with the air coming into it. Always set yourself up with one of these little disposable canister air filters. These are just a last ditch measure. You should really have an air dryer and stuff before your spray gun. We'll get into that a little bit later when I actually set up the air compressor. So the gun itself, so that threads, that little disposable filter threads onto here. This is a secondary regulator. Your primary regulator is on your air compressor, and then this is set to kind of rough fine tune the airflow in through this knob right here. All right, you'll always set it with the gun flowing air. You'll see this go up and down. We'll go over air pressures and what they do in a little bit. And then you have a very, very fine airflow adjustment here. Not all guns will have this, but it's becoming a more and more commonplace thing to the point where, like this is a Lowe's special cobalt gun. Same thing with the siphon feed gun. They came in a kit. You don't need a really super fancy, Iwata or Sharp or Binks, DeVilbiss. They're all really good spray gun manufacturers. But for what we're doing with it, you don't need to. The biggest advantage of the higher end guns as opposed to lower end guns like this or Harbor Freight or Eastwood or any of them, the advantage of the higher end guns is going to be mainly in what's called transfer efficiency. That's how much paint actually winds up on your panel that you're working on rather than bouncing back off the surface. They'll also lay out a little bit smoother because they atomize a lot better. We'll get into how atomizing works in a little bit. That's a interaction between these two components right here. But anyways, all right, so we got air going in. We adjust it here. A really fine adjustment right here. It travels up through galleys in the back of the gun. All guns are gonna have some sort of pattern adjustment, and that's between a very tall but very narrow fan, or it'll shrink it down and it gets a little more ovalish. A spray gun like these is always gonna spray in a fan of some manner. That's going to be dependent upon how you set it up, and we'll go over that, what the fan looks like and what you're looking for in a little bit. If you're spraying with a air brush, those always spray out in an actual cone coming out. That's why whenever you see somebody with an airbrush spraying, you always see the wrist moving in little circles. Well, that's to get the cones to overlap and fill in with each other. So these spray a flat blade going across. Okay, so air comes through here, and again, I'll fine adjust for your air pattern. And then, okay, best I can do here. All right, so that airflow is going to come, if you can see this in the video, there's a small air galley right here, and there's another air galley right there. Okay, so that's our airflow and our pattern adjustment, which is going to affect how hard the paint is coming out, along with the shape of the paint coming out. Okay, so now we've got the air part settled out for now. Let's start talking about the fluid. Fluid obviously is going to go into the cup. All right, whether it's be your primer, your color, or your clear, it's all going to go into here. The cup is always going to have a vent in the top, just like a fuel tank. You got to replace the exiting material with air, otherwise it'll start kind of spitting and sputtering just like a fuel tank will. The paint will do the same. Goes out the bottom here into the side of the gun. All right, and this is controlled on and off by an interaction between, it's called the fluid needle and the fluid cap. All right, different gun manufacturers will offer different size tips, and that the fluid needle is always going to be matched to the fluid cap. Very important to note that if you're trying to use like a 1.3 needle and a 1.4 cap, or vice versa, they don't work right. They don't seat correctly. There is a profile to the needle that matches a profile inside of the tip of the fluid cap. All right, and this is controlled by your trigger. This will all pass through the back and out the front. It's spring loaded to shut itself off, so if you let go of it, you just don't make a mess. So as we pull the trigger back, the needle goes back. I hope you can see that. All right, so based upon how far you pull the trigger is how much fluid it's going to let it come through. If we looked at, remember when we were looking at the front of the gun, out through the very center of it, this center portion right here, and you can see that open hole, that's where this fluid needle passes through. That's also what's allowing our fluid to pass through it. So this sits inside like this, like so, comes in and out, and it's metering how much fluid can flow through. Fluid is coming out, just the very tip, right there. And from our airflow adjustment, not our pattern adjustment, our airflow adjustment is coming out. Let me zoom this in. Is that gonna focus for me? Come on. There we go. All right, so our fluid is coming out here. That's where our needle sits, inside of there. And then these dots around the outside, all right, those are all drilled for airflow adjustment. The airflow is going to adjust how nicely atomized our paint is going to be, because all this air coming through is bouncing around and mixing up the paint. If you think about it, kind of like the intake tract of an old car, the reason it's rough inside is to help atomize the fuel. Same idea here. If we don't want to be spraying a hard solid stream on the component that we're trying to paint, because it's just not going to look nice, we want it to be a very nicely fine powder, is the wrong way to put it, so we say atomized. Atomized amount of fluid going onto the surface. And then finally, what's controlling our pattern is this is called the air cap. All right, this is grabbing air from elsewhere in the gun, and then we have kind of a couple of rectifying orifices These two little guys right here, they also help atomize to a small extent. And then we have these holes here, which are going to be forcing the sides of the pattern coming out of the gun. So as we adjust our pattern, more and more air pressure is being applied through these to give us our wider pattern or narrower pattern, taller, shorter pattern, and I will demonstrate what all those look like in a little bit. So let's put this gun together and we can see more what's going on as we put this together. So our fluid needle goes in the back and passes through. As I said, this is spring loaded. It's adjustment. All right. Our fluid cap, I always pull in, just makes it easier to thread on. Most guns are going to come with a wrench to help you assemble and disassemble this. Things don't have to be super tight. Everything seats on tapers or there's gaskets. If you make them super tight, it's just not fun to get it apart later. Important thing to note with spray guns, like we were just saying, how the air cap is controlling our pattern. We can also control the angle of our fan blade as we're working. Normally, you're going to set up straight side to side like this, and that will give you a pattern going up and down. If you rotate it 90 degrees, your pattern is going to go like this. All right. So as we're spraying right now, it's going to be long. It's going to be in this direction, which is 99.9% of the time exactly what you're going to want. Some people may need to adjust it slightly if they're holding their gun a little bit to the side or for different applications. For model airplanes, we don't need to worry about that. That's more of an automotive application. So we've got our fluid needle in. I'll adjust this real quick. All right, so the fluid needle now, that's tightened in all the way for minimal fluid. We can see that barely goes back. All right. Almost all the way out. You can feel the gun, it will have two stops. One will let airflow go through. You always want to let the air keep flowing while you're painting. And we'll talk about that later. But you know, the first stop that you feel, that's just airflow and only airflow. And then you can start letting fluid out through the rest of it. And you can also, as you're spraying, adjust how much you're pulling if you don't like what's going on. And you can always set this back really far and let full fluid flow if you want when you squeeze all the way. And then, you know, I mean, maybe as you're painting, you're only using half of your stroke. I like to set it so that as I'm painting, where I know that when I'm pulling all the way back, that's my ideal paint. And then if I need to dust stuff in, I can dust it in, but I'm not going to let it sit there and flow so much material that it's really easy to hang a run. You hang a run, then you got to sand it off, and right now we're trying to spend as little time with sandpaper as possible because we're tired of it from sanding the model. Then we put on our fluid cup. This gun's ready to spray. So from here on, we'll get into how to set up the compressor for what we're doing. All right, so we're just about ready to paint. So what we're gonna finish doing here is setting up. I've got the compressor already set. Here, I'll show you a quick picture of that. This is our compressor that we're using. Pardon the state of my yard. And that's from Lowe's, it's a Cobalt compressor. You don't need one big fancy one like that, that's a dual stage. We use a relatively small amount of air for what we're doing, but I use air tools on my motorcycles and cars and stuff like that, so big compressors come in handy. And of course we have Lucy hanging out with us, making a mess as she always does. Pardon the state of my backyard. Okay, so let's talk about the gun real quick. So we've got the air hose coming from the compressor out here. You want to have at least 50 feet between yourself and the compressor. Zero to do with noise or anything like that. The reason you want some amount of length instead of running straight off your compressor is so that you give the air time to drop, or the water in the air time to drop out of suspension. When you compress the air, it heats, then as it comes out of the compressor, it cools, and as it cools, that causes the water to start dropping out. So you need to give some amount of distance for that to happen if you run straight off the compressor. If your water catcher actually works, you're asking a lot out of it at that point. So give yourself some amount of distance for that to fall out. The compressor is set at about 80 pounds coming out of it. Again, that's a result of pressure loss. We don't use 80 at the gun, but you lose some amount of pressure going across your filter dryer, along with the little save your butt filter that I was talking about inside. And it's also a function of diameter of your hose too. So 80-90 pounds, somewhere around there. You don't want to go above 90. That's actually a OSHA standard and things like that. You don't want to go above 90 psi, just because you run the risk of bursts in your hose and your equipment. You just don't want to deal with that. You don't need that much when we're doing this. We're not running air tools. So our compressor is going to run into our dryer. On top of your dryer, there will always be a direction for flow. It's not going to work if you hook it up backwards. It'll still flow air, but it's not going to work. So double check your arrows for your airflow. And then I have some stretchy air hose that goes up to the gun at the end. So we hook up. Our air regulator we were talking about earlier. The air flows just above 20 pounds into the gun. This is the feel thing that people were telling me about. You just learn what it feels like. It gets strong, but it's not too strong. Yeah, that's why we got our cardboard here sitting on the ground. And I'll show you what goes on with that. I'll go mix up some primer and we'll start doing this. All right, so we got stuff mixed up. This is Klass Kote primer is what we're using. Well, let's see what our pattern looks like. Just start and put this together. You're gonna be about a foot from your surface. All right, it's kind of bright out here. I can't really see that well. Start with your air on, go across. All right, see how it looks kind of splotched and such? That's telling me maybe, let's try fluid first. I kind of like the fan pattern. Alright, let's try a little more air now. Or a little less air, I'm sorry. Try and get it to spray a little bit wetter. Wait a little. Oh, yeah. All right. Well, you see here our first pattern. It just looks kind of dry and nasty. Our second pattern looks a lot better, but still not quite there. Our third pattern, despite my grunt control, looks like it's going to lay down all right. And again, this is our cardboard rather than our product that we're going to be spraying on our substrate. So now it's time to actually spray the model and see what it looks like. All right, so we got our model. As we spray this, we're going to do about 50% overlap. Again, we're just spraying primer right now, so if we make an error in it, it's not going to be the end of the world. Clearly you don't want to be wearing your Sunday best doing this. I should be wearing a respirator right now. I'm not because I'm talking, so you guys can hear me better, but any catalyzed paint, super bad for you, super bad for you. So yeah, wear a respirator if possible, and always work with the wind at your back so you're blowing product away from you, and just go to town. Yeah, about 50% overlap. The paint's only going to go right where you're pointing it, so be sure to try and get into your edges. Hopefully you can see this. The less you put on, the less you got to take off, so be light with it within reason. Clearly you got to put on enough to fill in all your sand scratches, but you don't have to go crazy with it, because all your crazy sanding and filling should be well done before this. Klass Kote's very forgiving material, but you still got to pay attention while you're using it. Again, try and keep the air flowing as much as possible while I'm working. And hopefully you can see this. Hung a couple runs here and there, but whatever. Again, we're sanding it. There you go. And here we go. Smaller part. This is the cowl. Do them just like the bigger pieces. You can always adjust your fan pattern if you want to. Largely depends how well it behaves for you. Now remember, with painting, we're putting this stuff on. It's comparatively thin compared to everything else we've done. So as your paint goes on, it's only going to look as good as what's going on underneath. Oh, that's going to look cool when actual paint gets on it. Alright, there's a couple more parts to go. Alright, we got our elevator halves. I am noticing some runs starting to hang on them. I'm putting this on a little bit thick, but that's life. We'll get it right when we go to the color. And I'll try to be a little bit thinner on these. See if I manage to do it right. Again, not trying to make more work for yourself at this point. And there we go. A couple of light coats is always better than one thick, heavy one. You always got to remember what you're doing every time you go out to paint. Unless you build all the time. Which I try not to do. I try to fly all the time. Not that it shows. Alright, we got one last part after this. Got our last part. This is our top block. Got Egon hiding inside of here. We got one more little squish down. Well, hopefully we don't get it on our canopy, because I don't have mold for the canopy anymore, because I use this to make the mold. Oh, the one-shot deal. All right. Let's spray it. That'll do. And see, there you go. All those hours and hours and hours and hours you spend sanding, carving, more sanding, more carving, more cutting, throwing parts out because you made them wrong, and then more carving, and then more sanding for about 30 seconds with a spray gun. It blows your mind a little bit, but that's what makes it look cool. So, once I get this sanded out, maybe we'll do a video on masking, how to use a cricket and stuff like that. So, that's the spot. So, until then, if you can't be fast, try to look good while you're going slow.